There's a question I've never been able to fully answer, not even after 30 years of turning it over in my mind like a river stone in a dry palm. What does it cost a man to do the right thing when doing the right thing might kill him? I've heard plenty of men talk about honor. I've heard preachers deliver whole sermons on it. I've watched politicians use the word like it was currency, spending it on causes that never cost them a single night's sleep. But I only ever saw honor, real, bone-deep, quietly devastating honor, once, and it didn't come wrapped in speeches or carried on a flag. It came on the back of a dying horse, in the middle of a drought that had cracked the Arizona earth like old pottery, offered up by a man with mud on his boots, and nothing left to his name, but that horse and a piece of land the bank was already circling. His name was Emmett Calloway. He never asked me to write any of this down. He probably would have told me to stop if he'd known. Emmett wasn't the kind of man who wanted to be remembered. He was the kind of man who couldn't help but be. And I suppose that's the whole tragedy and the whole miracle of him, right there in the same breath. I was 26 when I rode onto his ranch for the first time, hired on to help with the fencing work because my previous outfit had folded when the river dried up. I kept a logbook, still do, out of old habit, thin leather cover, pencil tucked in the spine. I wrote down weather, cattle counts, things I noticed. My old foreman used to say I noticed too much for a ranch hand. He wasn't wrong. I noticed everything about Emmett Calloway. And what I'm about to tell you isn't a legend. It isn't myth polished smooth by too many retellings. It's exactly what I wrote down in those logbooks, word for word, sweat and doubt and all. Because some things deserve to be remembered the way they actually happened, ugly and holy, and completely unreasonable. The first time I saw Emmett Calloway, he was arguing with his own land. That sounds strange, I know, but there's no other way to put it. He was standing at the edge of the north pasture in the flat white heat of an August afternoon, staring at a section of fence post that had heaved itself loose from the cracked earth, and he was talking to it. Not cursing, talking. Low and measured, the way a man speaks to a mule he's trying to reason with. I pulled my horse up on the ridge and watched for a moment before riding down, because something about the scene made me feel I was interrupting something private. He was a lean man. Leaner than he should have been, I'd later understand, because he'd been feeding the last of the winter grain to his cattle rather than to himself. Maybe 50 years old, maybe older. Drought ages a man in ways that arithmetic can't account for. His face had the quality of old saddle leather left out in the sun, deeply lined, deeply weathered, but structurally sound in a way that made you think it had been tested and had not broken. His hat was pushed back on his head. His boots had been resoled so many times that the stitching ran in 4 different colors of thread. I rode down and introduced myself. He shook my hand without looking away from the fence post. "You the fencing man they sent from Tucson?" he said. "Yes, sir." "You eat breakfast?" "I did." "Good." He finally looked at me then. His eyes were the color of creek water, a gray-brown that shifted depending on what light hit them. "I can't feed you until supper. The cattle come first. If that's a problem, say so now." It wasn't a problem. I'd worked enough drought outfits to know the hierarchy. You learn it fast or you leave. That was August 4th. I wrote it in the logbook that night, sitting in the bunkhouse that was really just a converted storage shed with 2 cots and a wood stove that smoked sideways when the wind came from the west. Calloway Ranch, hot, dry, fence on north pasture collapsed X3 sections. New hire, man seems solid, cattle in poor condition, land worse. What I didn't write that first night, because I didn't yet have language for it, was the feeling that hung over the place. It wasn't despair exactly. Despair is a giving-up feeling, and nothing about Emmett Calloway had given up. It was something closer to what I imagine a man feels standing at the edge of a very long fall, that specific, crystalline awareness of how thin the margin is between where he is and where everything ends. Every morning on that ranch felt like that. Every fence post hammered back into the parched earth, every bucket of water hand-carried to the troughs, because the pump was pulling up mud. Every piece of harness mended with twine because there was no money for new leather. All of it was performed with a quiet, almost meditative determination that I found both inspiring and deeply unsettling. There were 4 of us working the ranch that summer. Myself, an older Mexican cowhand named Florencio who'd been with Emmett for 11 years and spoke maybe 40 words of English, but communicated everything important through eyebrow and gesture. a young kid from Oklahoma named Darnell who claimed to be 17, but was clearly 15 and eating like he was trying to make up for years of missed meals, and Emmett himself. We didn't talk much in the mornings. The heat arrived early and took something out of conversation before breakfast was done. We worked in a rhythm that developed naturally over the first week, Florencio and I on the fencing, Darnell on water duty, Emmett moving between everything, troubleshooting, patching, deciding. He had one horse left. I want you to understand what that meant, because in 1887 on a working cattle ranch in Cochise County, Arizona, a horse wasn't a luxury or a symbol. A horse was the difference between managing a 100-acre operation and being unable to manage it at all. A horse was your legs, your speed, your capacity to respond to any crisis that happened at the far end of the property rather than the near end. A horse was, in the most fundamental sense, the machinery of the whole enterprise. Emmett had sold 3 horses in the spring to cover back taxes. He'd sold 2 more in June to pay the water rights fee to the county, which had required payment in cash or would close his diversion channel from the creek. The same creek that was now providing 2 inches of muddy flow where there had been a foot of clear water a year before. What he had left was a gray mare named Cora. Cora was not a young horse. She was not a particularly large horse. But she was, and I say this as someone who has spent a lifetime around horses, the most fundamentally decent horse I have ever encountered. She had a quality I can only describe as professional patience. She stood still when she needed to stand still. She moved when she needed to move. She did not spook at snakes or sudden noises or the smell of cattle blood, and she came when Emmett whistled without being worked up to it. She was exactly the horse you'd want if you were down to 1 horse and hoping to survive a drought. Emmett cared for her the way some men care for the last thing they have left that still works. I had been on the ranch for 11 days when the Apache woman appeared. I say appeared because that's how it happened. One moment the South Ridge was empty, and the next she was there, at the edge of where our land met the open desert, holding herself upright with visible effort against the flank of a horse that could barely hold itself upright at all. I was the one who saw her first. I was out replacing wire on the south line, and I had my back to the ridge when Cora, who Emmett had left hitched to the post while he checked the water line upslope, suddenly went very still and alert. Horses do that when they sense something. Not fear exactly, but attention. I turned around and saw her. She was Apache. I could tell by the pattern of her dress, the silver at her wrists, the particular set of her posture even in what was clearly a state of extreme exhaustion. Later I would learn she was Chiricahua, one of the bands that had been pushed and scattered and devastated by the army campaigns of the previous decade. She was maybe 35 years old, maybe older. She was pregnant. The horse under her was dying. That was plain to anyone who knew horses. Its neck hung low, its eyes had gone dull with the particular glassiness that comes when an animal has used everything and there is nothing left to use. It was standing because horses sometimes stand even when they should fall, but it would not be standing much longer. She wasn't moving. She was holding the reins with both hands, and she was looking in the direction of the ranch buildings with an expression I recognized, not because I'd seen it on a person's face before, but because I'd felt it. It was the expression of a person who has run out of options and is looking at the only remaining door, knowing the door might not open. I dropped the fencing tool and started walking toward her. I didn't think about it. The thinking came later, as the thinking usually does. She watched me approach without retreating. That told me something. She was too exhausted to retreat, or she had decided that retreating was no longer worth the cost. Either way, she held her ground, which was its own kind of courage. I stopped about 15 feet away, because I didn't want to crowd her, and I didn't want to crowd the horse, which was trembling now in a subtle, rhythmic way that meant its legs were doing the last calculations. "Can I help you?" I said, which was an absurd and insufficient question, but was the only thing I had. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something in a language I didn't speak, and her hand moved to her abdomen, and that gesture required no translation at all. I turned and hollered for Emmett. He came at a run, which surprised me. Emmett Calloway did not run for small things. He ran when something was on fire or someone was bleeding. He arrived at my side breathing hard, took in the scene in approximately 3 seconds, and walked toward the woman at a calm, measured pace that somehow managed to be both non-threatening and immediately purposeful. He didn't say hello. He looked at the horse first. I know that sounds wrong, But it wasn't. He looked at the horse because the horse was the most immediate problem. It was the floor on which everything else rested, and it was about to collapse. He looked at it for maybe 4 seconds, and then he looked at the woman, and something in his face shifted in a way I had trouble reading. Later I would come to understand that Emmett Calloway was performing a very fast calculation that I wasn't capable of at 26, because I didn't yet understand all the variables. He was calculating the distance she had traveled, the condition of the horse, the time of day, the heat, the terrain between here and wherever she had come from, the fact that she was heavily pregnant, and the question, the central, pivoting question of what happens if he does nothing. He reached up to her without preamble and helped her down from the horse, and she let him, which told me again how far past choice she was. Florencio appeared from nowhere. He had a talent for that, and was already moving toward the dying horse with the particular efficiency of a man who knew what the situation required. He looked at Emmett once. Emmett gave the smallest nod I've ever seen a man give. Florencio took the horse's reins. The woman watched this exchange. She understood it. I saw her eyes move from the horse to Emmett to Florencio and back, and I saw the moment she understood what the nod meant, and I saw the thing that moved through her face when she understood it, something that wasn't gratitude exactly, or not yet, but was the more complicated thing that precedes gratitude, recognition of a cost being paid. Emmett settled her in the shade of the south wall of the house with a cup of water and a clean cloth, which were the only 2 things he had in abundance to offer, and then he walked back out to where Florencio was standing with the dying horse. I followed at a distance I thought was respectful. I had my logbook out. I know that probably looked callous. It's a habit I've never been able to break. The horse was on its knees by the time we reached it. Horses kneel before they fall. There's something in that, something I've never worked out the philosophy of, but it's always struck me. "How far?" Emmett said. Florencio looked at the horse's hooves, its mouth, its eyes. He held up 2 fingers, then thought about it and held up 3. 3 days' travel, in this heat with no water, carrying a pregnant woman. Emmett took his hat off and ran his hand through his hair, which was the single most expressive gesture I ever saw him make. Then he put his hat back on. "All right," he said. He looked at Cora, standing hitched to the post. Then he looked at the dying horse. Then he looked at the woman sitting against the wall of the house with her eyes closed and her hand on her abdomen. I wrote in my logbook, "He's going to do it. I can see it on him. He's already decided." I was wrong about when he decided, actually. I found out much later that he had decided the moment he saw the woman on the ridge. The looking and the calculation, all of that was not deliberation. It was preparation for what he had already determined. Emmett was the kind of man who made his real decisions in a layer below consciousness, and then used his conscious mind to figure out how to carry them out. He walked to Cora, untied her, and led her across the yard to where the woman sat. The woman opened her eyes when she heard the hooves. She looked at Cora, and then she looked at Emmett, and she said something that I later had translated for me. It was, roughly, "I cannot take what is yours." Emmett didn't understand the words, but he understood the refusal. He knelt down in front of her, which took something, I think, given the state of his knees after years of ranch work, and he looked at her levelly, and he said, in English she may or may not have understood, "The nearest settlement with a doctor is 30 miles north. My horse is yours. Take the creek trail, follow the water sound as long as you can hear it. Tell whoever you find that Calloway sent you." She looked at him for a long time. He stood, took Cora's reins, and held them out. What happened next I wrote down verbatim in the logbook, because I wanted to get it exactly right, and I knew I'd misremember it if I didn't anchor it in ink immediately. The woman reached out and took the reins, and then she said something in Apache that she clearly intended him to understand. And whether or not he understood the words, he understood the tone, because he gave a single nod. Not the small nod he'd given Florencio, but a full, slow nod. The kind that means I hear you and I believe you and we understand each other. Then she looked at me. I don't know why she looked at me. I was the least important person present. But she looked directly at me, and her eyes moved to my logbook, and something crossed her face, almost amusement, almost assessment, and then she looked away. Emmett helped her mount. He said something to Cora, I couldn't hear what, and then he stepped back and Cora walked. We watched her ride north until the heat shimmer took her. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Darnell had come out at some point without my noticing and was standing at the corner of the bunkhouse. His mouth was open. He looked at Emmett, then at the north horizon, then at Emmett again. "That was your last horse," Darnell said. He wasn't accusing, he was just processing. "I know what it was," Emmett said. He walked back inside the house. I looked at Florencio. Florencio was watching the place on the horizon where the woman had disappeared. His face held an expression I could only partially read, something between sorrow and the kind of calm that comes from witnessing something that confirms a belief you've held for a long time. He saw me watching him, and he said one of his 40 English words. "Buono," he said. I wrote it down. That night, sitting in the smoky bunkhouse with the logbook open on my knee, I tried to write down what I had seen and found that the words kept sliding away from the meaning. I wrote, "He gave away Cora today. Gave, not sold, not traded. Gave. To an Apache woman he'd never met who was 3 days from anywhere and running out of horse and time. He has nothing left now that moves on 4 legs. The ranch needs a horse to function. Without a horse, he cannot check the far pastures, cannot respond to emergencies, cannot manage the water infrastructure the way the cattle need it managed. I have never seen anyone do what he did today. Not because it was heroic. Heroic implies a certain amount of deciding. He didn't decide. He just did the thing that was obviously correct, the way you breathe without theater. I don't know what happens to this ranch now. I don't know what happens to that woman. I don't know what happens to Emmett Calloway. But I wrote it down. 3 days of very hard living followed that afternoon. Without Cora, the practical realities of the ranch contracted in painful ways. Florencio and I went to 3-hour shifts checking the water infrastructure on foot in 100-degree heat. Darnell ran messages between sections of the property at a pace that left him falling asleep in the middle of sentences by evening. Emmett was everywhere at once, moving with a relentless, quiet efficiency that I found myself watching with something close to obsession. He never mentioned Cora. He never expressed doubt about what he'd done or self-congratulation either. He simply recalibrated, reorganized the logistics of the operation around the new reality, the way you'd reorganize a load when you lose a pack animal, practically, without ceremony. But I noticed things. I noticed that he stood longer than usual at the north fence line in the evenings, looking toward the horizon. I noticed that he started sleeping lighter, that the sounds of the night that he'd previously slept through now brought him to the window of his house, just checking, just looking. I noticed that he ate less than he already had been eating. On the 3rd day, I woke before dawn to use the outhouse and saw him sitting on the porch in the dark, hat in his hands, not moving. I went back inside and lay on my cot and listened to the coyotes a long way off, and I thought about what it costs a man to do the right thing and spend the following days not knowing whether it worked. I wrote in the logbook, "Day 3 without Cora. He's waiting. He hasn't said so, but he's waiting." I put the pencil down and stared at the ceiling. And then, just before first light, something changed in the air outside, a new sound, a different quality of morning silence. And Emmett stood up from the porch chair, and he walked to the fence line, and he stood there very still. I heard it a few seconds later. Hoofbeats, not 1 horse, not 2. Many. I got up and went to the window and looked out into the gray pre-dawn. And I wrote the last thing in the logbook entry for that night in handwriting that came out noticeably less steady than my usual. Something is coming. I want to be precise about the light, because the light matters. Dawn in Arizona in August doesn't arrive the way dawn arrives in places with clouds and temperament. It comes in a single long exhalation. One moment the world is the gray of old ash, and the next it has color, hard-edged and certain, as if someone has reached up and turned a lamp to full. There's no gradual brightening, no comfortable easing into morning. The sun simply decides the night is done and acts accordingly. The riders came with that light. I was standing at the bunkhouse window, which faced north and east, so I had the horizon behind them, and they were visible against it first as a mass, then as a shape, then as something that my mind refused to initially categorize correctly because there was no category in my previous experience that fit. I had seen cattle drives. I had seen army columns. I had seen the remnants of raiding parties moving fast across open ground, and I had seen the disciplined procession of a tribal gathering moving toward a meeting place. I had seen all of these things separately and over many years. I had never seen 300 Apache riders moving as a single body through the early morning toward a ranch that had nothing left to defend itself with. I pulled on my boots and went outside. Emmett was at the fence. He hadn't moved from where I'd last seen him in the dark. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his hat on and his face turned toward the north, and his posture had that particular quality I'd noticed in him, not rigid, not relaxed, but present, fully occupying the moment without fighting it. Florencio was already there. I don't know when he'd gotten up. He was standing slightly behind and to the right of Emmett, and he had his hat in his hand, which Florencio never did during working hours. I walked to the fence and stood on the other side of Emmett from Florencio. "That's more than 100, I said. "Yes," Emmett said. "Are you worried?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm trying to figure out what to be." That was the most I'd ever heard him say about his interior life, and I recognized immediately that he'd said it to himself as much as to me. I wrote it down in the logbook on the spot, standing at the fence in the early morning, because I knew I'd sand the edges off it later if I didn't capture it exactly. Darnell came stumbling out of the bunkhouse with one boot on and his shirt untucked, and the look of a person who has not yet decided whether he is awake. He saw the riders. He put the other boot on with some urgency. The riders slowed as they reached the outer edge of what would traditionally be considered approach distance, maybe 300 yards from the fence. They didn't stop. They kept moving, but the pace changed from a purposeful traveling pace to something more deliberate, more conscious of terrain and the space between them and the buildings ahead. They spread slightly as they slowed, the way a flock of birds spreads when it senses a change in the wind. At 300 yards, against the flat morning light, I could begin to make out individuals. They were riders of every description, men and women both, some old, some young, some on horses that were clearly well tended and some on horses that had clearly had a harder recent history. They were dressed differently from each other, some in the traditional patterns I recognized as Chiricahua, some in a mix of traditional and what had filtered in from trade or capture or necessity. Some carried rifles, some carried lances, some carried nothing visible at all. I noticed that none of the rifles were raised. Emmett noticed the same thing. I could tell by the tiny, controlled exhale he made. "Open the gate," he said. I looked at him. "Emmett." "Open it," he said, in a tone that wasn't harsh but was finished. The kind of tone that means the decision has been made, and this part of the conversation is done. I opened the gate. They came through slowly. Not the whole column at once. A vanguard of perhaps a dozen riders moved through the gate first, and they came to a stop in the yard in a formation that I recognized without being able to articulate why, as respectful rather than aggressive. They positioned themselves with space between their horses facing the porch, not surrounding, not advancing, occupying space in a way that said we are here and we intend to be seen, but we are not here to take. Behind them, the column waited. I stood at Emmett's shoulder and tried to make myself as unremarkable as possible, which I was reasonably good at. I was the kind of person who could become furniture in most situations, and I was very much furniture at this moment. I had my logbook, I had my pencil. My hand was shaking slightly, but not unmanageably. In the center of the vanguard was the woman. She was on Cora. Cora looked, and I write this knowing how it sounds, different. Not physically, not dramatically, but there was something in how the mare carried herself that I couldn't entirely account for. I'd had 11 days to observe Cora's habits and her usual quality of presence, and what I was seeing now was that quality elevated slightly, the way a horse is elevated when it understands that the moment it's in matters. The woman rode to within 15 feet of the porch and stopped. She looked at Emmett. She looked well. Better than she had 3 days ago, not recovered exactly, but past the crisis. There was color in her face and she was sitting straight, which she hadn't been able to do when I first saw her. She was still pregnant, visibly, undeniably pregnant, and the fact that she had ridden however far she'd ridden back to this place in this condition said something that I found myself writing down in the shorthand I used for things I needed to process later. Then she spoke, at length, in Apache with a precision and formality that even I could recognize as deliberate. None of us understood a word. The silence after she finished was the kind of silence that has its own weight and meaning. A man from the vanguard moved his horse forward. He was older, 60, perhaps, with a face that had the specific quality of long authority, the ease of a person who had made decisions for others for so long that the act of deciding had become indistinguishable from breathing. He carried himself with a dignity that required no display. In accented but clear English, he said, "She says, 3 days ago a man gave his last horse to a woman he did not know, who carried a child he would never see because she needed it and he had it. She says, no one does this without reason that goes deep. She says, she did not want to receive this gift without returning something of equal weight." He paused. "She says, the only thing of equal weight that she has to offer is us." I wrote this down. My hand was steadier by this point, which surprised me. I think the steadiness came from the feeling that I was witnessing something so completely outside the ordinary run of events that my body had decided ordinary responses were inapplicable. Emmett stepped off the porch. He walked the 15 feet to where the woman sat on Cora with the unhurried, direct movement of a man who has decided that the situation calls for presence rather than posture. He stopped at Cora's shoulder. He looked up at the woman. He said, and I heard this clearly, and I wrote it down clearly, "The horse was alone. I'd like her back when you've got no more need of her." The translator relayed this. The woman's face did something complex and layered that I will never fully describe to my own satisfaction, and then she laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, not loud, but completely genuine, the laugh of someone who has been caught off guard by something that pleases them. And I want you to understand that of all the things I witnessed during those weeks on the Callaway Ranch, that laugh is the detail that has stayed with me the most vividly across 30 years. Because in that laugh was the entire resolution of the tension that had been building since the first moment she appeared on the South Ridge. She reached down and offered the reins. He took them. Cora bumped her nose against his shoulder the way horses do when they've been somewhere else for a while and are confirming the familiar. Emmett put a hand on her neck without looking away from the woman. What followed was not what I expected. I had been composing in the back of my mind the version of this story in which 300 riders had come to offer tribute, or to make a display of gratitude, or to perform some kind of ceremony of reciprocity that would stand as the emotional climax, and then conclude. I had been preparing, narratively, for a grand gesture. What I got instead was a morning of work. Not symbolic work, not ceremonial work, actual, practical, necessary work. The older man, his name, as I later learned through Florencio's patient gestures and my own dogged logbook translation work, was something I'll render in English phonetics as Two Hawk, though that is imprecise. Two Hawk turned to the column behind him and spoke a few words. The column broke into smaller groups with an efficiency and coordination that spoke of long practice, and those groups fanned out across the ranch with a purposefulness that left me standing at the fence gate trying to understand what was happening. One group went directly to the north pasture and began repairing fence. Not the 3 sections I'd been working on, all of it. Every collapsed or compromised section on the north line. They had tools, not the same tools we had, but tools adequate to the task and in some cases more thoughtful for the terrain, and they worked fast and well. Another group went to the water troughs and began what I can only describe as an irrigation intervention. They dug new channels by hand in the baked earth, following lines of terrain I would not have identified as useful, but which, I could see as the work developed, were going to change how water moved through the property during the dry season. They were reading the land's hydrology with a precision that humbled me, and I'd been looking at that land for 11 days. A third group, mostly the older men and women, went to the cattle. I followed this group, partly out of curiosity and partly because cattle were something I understood, and I wanted something comprehensible to anchor myself to. What they were doing with the cattle was at first opaque to me, and then gradually, as I watched, became obvious. They were assessing. Going through the herd animal by animal with the methodical thoroughness of experienced herders, identifying which cattle were in genuine crisis, which were stressed but recoverable, which were healthy enough to be used as breeding stock through the coming hard months. They were organizing a triage of the herd that would take Emmett weeks to do alone and that they completed in a morning. I was standing watching this when Florencio appeared at my shoulder. "Conocen el ganado," he said. "They know cattle." "Yes," I said. "Conocen la tierra también." They know the land, too. "Yes," I said. He made a small sound, not quite a laugh but close, and went back to work. Emmett moved through all of this with a quality that I struggled to name. He wasn't directing, no one needed him to direct, because the groups clearly knew what they were doing and had divided the work along lines of internal competence that didn't require his input. He wasn't supervising, exactly. He was more like witnessing, moving from group to group with a watchfulness that wasn't suspicious but was deeply attentive, the way a man walks through something he is trying to memorize. I followed him for a while, staying at the edge of his awareness, which he tolerated with the resigned acceptance of a man who has decided that the person following him is harmless and persistent in equal measure. At one point, he stopped at the south end of the property and looked out over what was being done and what was being transformed, and I stopped a few feet behind him and tried to find words for what I was seeing. 300 people working a single ranch, not frantically, not in chaos, but with the calm, distributed competence of a community that had been managing difficult land and difficult circumstances for longer than any white ranch operation in the territory had existed. They were applying to Emmett's 40 acres a knowledge base that had been cultivated across generations on this specific landscape. "You know," I said to Emmett, without particularly planning to say anything, "this land is going to look different by tomorrow." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, he said, "It should have looked like this all along." I wrote that down. The woman, I learned her name, roughly, as something I'll render as Saya, came to find me in the afternoon. This startled me. I was sitting in the shade of the east wall working through my logbook, trying to get the morning into language before the details blurred, and I became aware of someone settling into the shade near me. I looked up. She was looking at my logbook. I felt suddenly self-conscious about it in a way I hadn't expected. This object that I carried everywhere, that I thought of as private and functional, being regarded with visible curiosity. I said, "You can look if you want." She held out her hand. I hesitated for only a moment and then gave it to her. She turned the pages slowly, reading nothing. The words were in English and clearly not meaningful to her, but looking at something else. The density of the entries, maybe, the physical evidence of sustained attention. She turned to the most recent pages, which were covered in notes from the morning, and looked at those for a longer time. Then she handed it back. She said something. I looked helplessly for the translator, who was occupied elsewhere. She seemed to understand the problem and thought for a moment, and then she made a gesture, tapping her temple with 2 fingers and then opening her hand outward toward the horizon. And then she tapped the logbook. I sat with this for a moment. "You mean?" I tried to find a gesture that conveyed the same thing in reverse. I tapped the logbook, then tapped my temple. She considered this. Then she did something I didn't expect. She reached out and put her hand briefly on top of the logbook, just rested it there for a second, and then she moved it to her own chest over her heart. Not on her head, her heart. I wrote this down the moment she walked away with slightly shaking hands again. I wrote, "She's not saying I write what I think. She's saying I write what I feel. And she's saying it's the same as what she does, whatever she does, wherever she carries it. I don't know what to do with this. I think that's the correct response." The sun was dropping toward the western peaks when the formal part of the day concluded. Hawk came to Emmett on the porch with deliberate ceremony, stepped up, turned to face the assembled groups who had gathered in the yard, and spoke for a while in Apache that I could not follow, but that had the rhythm and formal structure of something prepared rather than improvised. The gist of it, as the translator conveyed afterward, was this. The Callaway Ranch, the 40 acres, the cattle, the water rights, the fence lines, the physical structures, would be known to the Chiricahua bands as a place of open hospitality, not a place claimed or appropriated, not a place under their protection in the sense of being owned, but a place whose owner had demonstrated something specific about his character, and to which the knowledge and labor of the community would be freely offered in the future, as it had been offered today when the need arose. The word he used, the translator labored over it, was something like reciprocal sanctuary, a place that gives and a place that receives in both directions with the same degree of commitment. Emmett listened to all of this. Then he took his hat off, which he did almost never, and he said, "Tell him I'm grateful. Tell him I'll try to deserve it." The translator conveyed this. Hawk looked at Emmett for a moment with those long authority eyes, and then he said something brief. The translator said, "He says you already did. I want to tell you that the evening was peaceful and warm, and that food appeared and laughter, and some kind of joyful celebration that wrapped everything into a satisfying conclusion. Some of that happened. Food appeared, the riders had brought provisions on pack horses that I'd barely registered in the morning, and a meal was assembled in the yard that was unlike any food I had eaten before, prepared with an efficiency that made Darnell's eyes go very wide. There was something like celebration, not loud, not elaborate, but present. Voices, movement. But I spent most of the evening sitting slightly apart, watching Emmett. He sat on the porch, he ate when food was brought to him, he spoke when spoken to. He watched the people in his yard with the expression I'd been trying to classify for 3 weeks. That quality I couldn't name. I finally named it that evening. It was gratitude without surprise. The gratitude of a man who had done what seemed to him like the only possible thing and had discovered that the world had more given it than he'd feared, and who felt that grace deeply without being astonished by it, because his faith in human generosity, across every kind of line, had never entirely left him even when the evidence for it was thin. He caught me looking. "Writing it down," he said. "Already did," I said. He nodded, looked back at the yard. "Good," he said. "Somebody should." The riders left before noon the next day. They left the way they'd arrived, in a body organized, with Two Hawk at the lead and Saya somewhere toward the center of the column where the pace was safest for a woman in her condition. They left the fences rebuilt, and the water channels restructured, and the cattle sorted and the north pasture rearranged in a way that would make a visible difference to how that section of land held and distributed the little moisture it received. They left Cora in the paddock, fed and brushed. They left a set of hand tools arranged against the east wall of the bunkhouse that none of us had seen brought in. They didn't make a departure ceremony out of it. They simply, one morning, began to leave. Emmett stood at the gate and watched them go, and I stood near him, and Florencio stood near us, and Darnell stood slightly behind Florencio and tried to look like a person who had processed everything that had happened and succeeded only partially. Which was all of us, honestly. Which was all of us. When the last rider had cleared the gate, Emmett closed it. Not with any drama. He just closed the gate, latched it, and stood there with his hand on the latch for a moment. "Well," Darnell said. "Yes," Emmett said. Florencio said nothing. "I wrote, they're gone. The ranch looks different. I don't mean that poetically. I mean it literally looks structurally, practically different. The fencing runs better. The water channels run better. The cattle are in different positions than where they were, and those positions, I'm starting to understand, are more defensible against the heat. The 40 acres that was failing is still under pressure, but it's a different kind of under pressure. Like a man who was drowning and is now just very tired, still in trouble, but not the same trouble. Something changed. I don't know how to explain it beyond that. We worked the rest of August. Harder than before in some ways, harder because now there was more ranch to maintain, more infrastructure to keep up with, more cattle to monitor. But harder in a different register. The hardness had changed quality. Before, the work had the flavor of fighting a losing battle, that particular grinding endurance you develop when you believe the outcome is probably defeat, but you've committed to the attempt anyway. After, the work had something else in it. Not confidence, exactly. More like possibility. The sense that the land was no longer entirely working against us. The water channels made the biggest difference. 3 days after the riders left, a flash storm moved through the territory, brief, intense, the kind of desert storm that drops 2 inches in 40 minutes and causes more flooding than absorption in normal circumstances. With the new channels, the water moved differently. Instead of sheeting across the baked surface and running off into the arroyos, it was directed, gently, cleverly, with an understanding of the land's own topography that no surveyor's instrument would have produced, into the shallow basins near the pasture areas. By the time the storm was done, the north pasture had moisture in it that would last 3 weeks. Emmett stood in the north pasture 2 days after the storm with the expression of a man who is looking at something he doesn't fully understand, but is deeply, quietly moved by. I stood near him, logbook in hand. "They read the land," he said. He wasn't talking to me exactly. He was talking to the fact of it, the reality of it. "They've been reading it longer than anyone else has been here," I said. He turned that over for a while. "I suppose they have," he said. September came, and with it a slight easing of the heat. Not much, just enough to change the quality of suffering from constant to intermittent, which was its own kind of relief. I had extended my stay past the original fencing job by this point, without any formal conversation about it. I simply didn't leave when the fence work was done, and Emmett didn't tell me to go, and after a while the question became irrelevant. The logbook was filling up. I had moved from practical notes about water and fencing into something else entirely, without quite noticing the transition, longer entries, more reflection, more of what Saya had gestured at when she touched her chest. More of what I felt and less of what I observed, though on my better days they were the same thing. Darnell stayed too. He'd stopped lying about his age and had admitted he was 15, which didn't change anything practically but seemed to relieve him. Florencio, of course, had never been going anywhere. We became something like a unit. Not a family, that word has too much warmth and history in it for what we were. A unit. 4 people maintaining a piece of land through difficult circumstances, each contributing what they had, falling into a rhythm that made the work manageable even when it wasn't easy. Emmett anchored it, not through authority exactly, or not only through authority, through consistency. He was always up first. He was always the last one to stop working. He always knew what needed doing and moved toward it without waiting for someone to notice it needed doing. He never made theatrical speeches about keeping on or not giving up. He simply kept on and didn't give up, and the fact of it was instruction enough. The second visit from the Apache came in mid-September. Not 300 writers. This was a smaller group, perhaps 20, and it came without drama, without ceremony, without anything that I would have recognized as a formal visit if I hadn't been watching the South Ridge out of some developing habit of attention. 2 Hawk was with them, and Saya, and wrapped against her chest in the careful cradle of a carrying cloth, a baby. I was at the south fence when they arrived, and I saw her before Emmett did. I stood very still and looked at her for a moment, the way she sat Cora with the child against her chest, the way the child's head was turned and already looking at things with that particular unfocused but eager alertness of very new people. And I thought about the horse and the ridge and the question of what it costs a man to do the right thing and what it returns, and I felt something move through my chest that I have not been able to adequately describe in 30 years of trying. I went and got Emmett. He was in the bunkhouse sharpening a tool with the careful, meditative attention he brought to every task. I said, "You need to come outside." He heard something in my voice. He put the tool down and came. He saw Sayer on the south ridge. He saw the child. He stopped walking. I stopped a few feet behind him. I had the logbook open. My pencil was in my hand. He stood there for a long moment, long enough that the question of what he was thinking or feeling became something I couldn't resolve from the outside, because his face had gone very still in a way that could have meant many things. Then he walked to the gate, and he opened it, and he stood back. Saya rode in. She came directly to him and stopped Cora close enough that she could have touched him without leaning far. She looked at him for a moment with those same layered, complicated eyes, and then she shifted the carrying cloth and turned the child toward him. The child was perhaps 2 weeks old. Healthy, clearly, fat-cheeked and bright-eyed and expressing, with the uncomplicated confidence of something very new to the world, a complete and temporary interest in the large, weathered-looking man in front of it. Emmett looked at the child. He put out one finger, carefully, the way a large man handles something small with a self-consciousness about the scale difference, trying to make himself less than he was. The child grabbed the finger with the blind, absolute certainty of a new hand finding a grip. Emmett made a sound I had never heard from him before and won't attempt to describe, because some sounds lose their meaning the moment you try to render them in language. He stood very still with the child gripping his finger, and his face did what faces do when they are finally allowed to do what they've been withholding. I am going to skip the middle portion of this visit. Not because nothing happened, it did. 2 Hawk spoke. The translator conveyed. Practical matters were discussed about mutual use of water and land, about the coming winter, about what the Chiricahua knowledge of the local terrain could offer to ranching operations, and what ranching operations could potentially offer in return during seasons when certain materials were scarce. None of this was romantic. It was practical and careful, and filled with the real texture of 2 groups of people who live in the same difficult landscape, trying to figure out how to do that less destructively. All of this mattered. I wrote it all down. But what I keep coming back to, what I have kept coming back to for 30 years, is a smaller moment that happened at the edge of all the larger ones. Saya found me in the afternoon. Again, same way as before, sitting with my logbook in the shade, this time of the east wall with the bunkhouse tools beside me. She sat down near me. The child was asleep against her chest. We sat in silence for a while. Then she said something, and looked at me with the expression of someone who has worked out what they want to say, and is saying it carefully. I didn't have the translator. I looked helpless. She thought for a moment, then she reached out and took my logbook again as she had before, turned the pages. Found an entry, I don't know which one, and stopped. She pointed at a line. I looked. It was the line I'd written the day Emmett gave away Cora. He's already decided. She looked at me, she pointed at the line again, then she pointed at herself. I sat with this. She had seen me writing, the day on the ridge. She had seen me write that line, or not that line specifically, but something in the moment of the giving. And she had known from the act of writing it down that I had seen it correctly, that I had witnessed it and understood it. And she was telling me that she had known it too, from the other side of it. From the receiving end of a decision already made, she had known it was real because of the quality of the offer. No hesitation, no theater. No calculation about what he might receive in return. Just the giving of the thing. I said quietly, stupidly, he didn't know if it would be enough. She didn't understand the words, but she looked at me for a moment with what I can only describe as patient, complete attention, and then she did what she had done before. She touched the logbook, and then she put her hand on her chest. Write what you feel. Remember it there. The group left in the evening of the second day. Saya left Cora. This time Emmett didn't take the reins immediately. He stood at Cora's head for a moment, and something passed between them, man and horse, which is its own language and one I'll leave untranslated. And then he turned to Saya, and he spoke with the deliberate care of a man who wants to make sure he is understood. She's yours, he said. Whatever you need her for, whenever you need her, I'll take care of her when you don't. Hawk translated, Saya listened. Then she said something back, and the translator looked briefly uncertain about how to render it. He tried. She says this is the same as before, and this is why she came back. Emmett didn't say anything to that. Neither did I. I left the Callaway Ranch in late October. I had been there 3 months, instead of the week the fencing job called for. My logbook from that period fills 2 volumes, one from the summer, one from the fall, and they are the most detailed records I have ever kept, which is saying something given my established problem with overnoticing. Emmett shook my hand at the gate. Send me a copy of that thing when you're done with it, he said. He meant the logbook. I'm not sure I'll ever be done with it, I said. He nodded, as if this was the answer he'd expected. Then he started, stopped, started again. Just get it right, that's all. Get what right? He looked at the gate, at the ranch behind it, at the rebuilt fence line, and the restructured land, and the cattle in the north pasture, standing in moisture that shouldn't have been there. Whatever you end up calling it, he said. Just get it right. I have been trying to get it right for 30 years. The ranch survived. I learned this from Florencio, who wrote to me twice in the years after I left, careful Florencio letters, mostly weather and cattle counts, but with enough between the lines that I could read the larger story. The winter of 1887 was bad but manageable. The spring of 1888 brought enough rain to restore the water table. The cattle recovered. The operation continued. Emmett Callaway never got rich. That was never the direction the land was going to go, and he knew it. But the ranch held. It held through the drought cycles of the 1890s and through the government land pressures that forced out bigger operations than his. It held, I believe, in part because of what the Apache riders had built into the landscape that August morning. The water channels that still, as far as I know, direct rain toward the north pasture. Whether that is fact or sentiment, I'm no longer sure. It's both, probably. The best things usually are. I never found out what Saya named the child. This is a gap in the record that I spent years trying to close and eventually made peace with. I know, from what the translator conveyed, that the birth had been difficult. I know that the child survived and thrived in those first weeks. I know that Saya returned to her community, and that the child was born into a band that was under tremendous ongoing pressure from government removal and the destruction of traditional land access. I know the child existed, I know the child was alive, 2 weeks old, on a horse named Cora in front of a man who had no earthly reason to have saved its mother, and had done so anyway. I have decided that the not knowing is appropriate. Some things belong to the people who lived them, and not to the people who wrote them down. There is a question I've been holding since the beginning, and I owe you an honest attempt at answering it. What does it cost a man to do the right thing when doing the right thing might kill him? Here is what I observed. It cost Emmett Calloway his last horse 3 days of operational paralysis, a level of physical and psychological stress that left visible marks in his sleep and his appetite and the quality of his silences. It cost him certainty about his future, which was already uncertain. It cost him nothing he had been planning to keep anyway, not because he was indifferent to the cost, but because some people are built in a way that makes certain costs irrelevant when weighed against the alternative. And what did it return? 300 riders, rebuilt fences, restructured water, a generation of knowledge applied to 40 acres in a single morning, a reciprocal sanctuary that held through drought and pressure and time, a child alive and present gripping a weathered finger. And though this is the part I am least certain how to say, something that is harder to measure and more important than any of the rest of it. The confirmation that the world has more give in it than we fear. That generosity, extended into uncertainty, does not simply disappear into the void, but travels outward in ways we can't predict and can't control and can't fully witness. Emmett didn't know any of that the day he gave Cora away. He couldn't have. He just did the thing that was obviously correct. Like breathing. The last logbook entry I wrote from the Calloway Ranch is short. I've looked at it many times over the years. It says, October 22nd, cool morning, first real cold of the season coming in from the northwest. Emmett checked the north pasture before breakfast. The channels are holding. The cattle are where they need to be. Florencio is already working. I am packed to leave. I stood at the gate this morning and looked at the south ridge out of habit. The ridge was empty. The desert was quiet in the particular way it gets when the heat has finally broken, and the land is resting.